I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm a big believer in trying to facilitate dialogue and cross-fertilization among different academic disciplines. It's not only parts of cities that exist as fortified islands in isolation from each other, but often it's discourses and communities of scholarship. And for that matter, the divides can be very great between those who study social phenomenon and those who are out in the field dealing with them on a daily basis. And so I think that Vanya has done a very fine job in formulating an agenda and bringing together, building some bridges between some of these islands. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my field of study, which is crisis management. I have had a sustained interest in crisis management in the urban context, which I will tell you a little bit about. But the research group that I lead, the National Center for Crisis Management Research and Training, CRISMART, we have a somewhat broader focus. We actually study and do applied work in partnership with government and non-governmental organizations, looking at crisis management from a number of perspectives, from local to county to larger regional to national and EU perspectives. We look at issues of crime and public disorder, but we also look at a wide range of other types of threats. We usually describe our agenda as all hazards plus. What could be more than all hazards? Well, we also look at issues involving crises of confidence and legitimacy in government, political scandals, that kind of thing. We look at the before, the during, and the after of crisis management. How does one prepare for nasty events? How does one try to prevent them, of course? How does one organize to be able to deal with the extraordinary demands of crisis situations? How does one make decisions when there are indications that something very frightening, disturbing, dangerous is occurring? How does one communicate about those decisions in a way that enables people to protect themselves and do their jobs effectively and hopefully maintain confidence in their public institutions, assuming those public institutions are deserving of confidence, which is not always the case, but sometimes is. And we really, our raison d'etre is to try to learn from these kinds of experiences, to extract lessons, best practices, ways of organizing or working in order to make us safer in the future. CRISMART's activities organized in terms of basically three types of activities: basic scientific research, more applied scientific and consulting work, again in partnership with various government agencies and other bodies. And we do a lot of education and training. Partly that is about people coming to us here at the Defense College, and we do courses. You can get master's degrees in political science, crisis management, for instance. But we also go out to organizations and help them to exercise and prepare, identify weaknesses, develop their competence to deal with these. For instance, we've had the honor of training the mayor of Stockholm and what do we call it? The aldermen, as well as various types of professionals in city government. Okay, enough about CRISMART. What I'm going to do is to give you some reminders of what we're talking about, some images of crisis situations. Then we're going to look and see what are some of the core concepts involved in crisis management, particularly the concept of crisis, but we'll talk a little bit about some relationships between crisis and other sister concepts. Say a few words about some broader trends that I think are very germane to understanding the way that crisis management plays out in modern urban environments. We're going to talk a little bit about what are the advantages of the urban setting in terms of dealing with extraordinary challenges and dangerous events. And we're going to also look at some of the disadvantages. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the challenge of getting various organizations to work together. Obviously, if one's looking at the problem of urban security, there are many different types of actors who might be involved, ranging from schools to police organizations to rescue services to city and county government to medical services. And how does one try to get those organizations on the same page and working together, particularly if you're dealing with rapidly moving, dramatic, controversial types of events? I'll say a few words about that. I probably, if I say something that's very confusing or that you think is really crazy and you want to jump in and say something, you can raise your hand along the way, and we don't have to save all of the questions for the discussion session. Images of crisis. Now, the word crisis is something that you see in the mass media and in popular discourse all over the place and can mean practically anything. And so I think I have to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here and why it might be relevant to the issue of urban security and sustainable development. I think if you think about the news coverage in recent years, we've seen many dramatic events in urban settings around the world, both north, south, east, and west, so to speak. If we look at the issue of terrorism, we've seen very vivid, dramatic images from cities like New York during 9/11, London during the 7/7 bombings, which is a case, actually both 9/11 and 7/7 are cases which my colleagues and I have studied in some detail. The Madrid bombings, we've seen terrorism in India and many other cities around the world, of course. And these are events that are terrifying and disruptive in many ways. We see other forms of socio-political conflict. Today in Athens, there are general strikes and demonstrations. We've had people killed during the month of May and wide-scale public disorder. That is a great challenge. And of course, this coincides with a very dramatic financial crisis for Greece, which is in many ways, as Vanya was talking about, linked to some of the dynamics of conflict here. We've seen dramatic episodes of violence in suburbs of Paris. In Gothenburg, not so very long ago, we saw politically inspired rioting in conjunction with the previous Swedish presidency, another case my colleagues and I have studied closely. We see natural disasters. It's often the case that natural phenomenon wreak havoc in rural settings, but in fact, recent history shows us that major urban centers may also be hit and life disrupted in a tremendous way. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans is a fascinating case where urban vulnerability and an interplay of policy and planning issues and fickle Mother Nature lead to devastating consequences and a great deal of political controversy. And not everybody was convinced that the management of the Katrina crisis was handled well, to say the least. We've seen images of turbulence and both very cooperative social behaviors and some less cooperative ones in Port-au-Prince after the Haiti earthquake. Critical infrastructure. Cities are dependent on complicated socio-technical systems for their lifelines and for their functionality, and those systems sometimes fail us. In fact, my debut in the area of urban crisis management was a study of that was ultimately published under the slightly wise guy name of Auckland Unplugged, which was about a nearly 6-week-long power failure in Auckland, New Zealand in 1998, an area much like Stockholm City, the financial capital of New Zealand. What happens when the banks don't have, not only that their computers don't work, but they don't have lights and the air conditioning doesn't work in hot summer days, and the temperature in the offices goes up to 50 degrees? Just to take another type of example. And of course, public health issues. We've been talking a lot about H1N1 flu. Some years ago, we saw cities like Beijing and Ottawa disrupted by threatening infectious agents. Wow, that was a lot of stuff, wasn't it? Yeah. Apples, it is a scary world. Fascinating to study, but obviously very, very serious threats. Here was a lot of apples and pears and oranges and pineapples. So what do those things have in common? Why should we consider them fruit, or in this case, crises? I would argue to you, and I have said that there are many ways in casual discourse, and almost as many ways, fortunately or unfortunately, in scientific discourse to define the word crisis. Now, I don't think that's a particular problem. A definition is always related to a purpose, and it's a good definition if it suits your purpose, and it's a poor definition if it doesn't suit your purpose. And this definition, I and a lot of my practical partners over the years have found to be a useful definition, which gets at some of the issues that separate crises from everyday life. For the first of all, in a crisis, core values are at stake. That means the things we really care about are at risk. And that may be life, it might be liberty, it might be our health, it might be the viability of our economic systems. If it's a crisis, it's because the very important things are at stake. Often we emphasize that they're threatened, but we should point out that crises also bring extraordinary opportunities. Sometimes there are opportunities for old enemies to help each other in a crisis and build trust and help to deal with conflicts. Crises provide opportunities for leaders and their organizations to show that they are wise and decisive and competent and caring, and that they deserve the trust that their citizens have put into them. And if they don't live up to that, there's a very big price to be paid. The notion of urgency. Often these are fast-moving events. Now we should keep in mind that the incubation period, often that there are longer-term structural processes that set the stage for a crisis. And those may be fairly slow-moving and subtle and hard to see. But the kinds of incidents that I was talking about there, many of them are quite literally explosive. And you go from thinking that it's an ordinary day to suddenly realize that life as we know it has ceased, and it may be very difficult to reestablish. Our notions of what's proper, of what's possible, of what's safe, suddenly are very much disturbed. And in those situations, there's a possibility sometimes to act proactively to minimize the disruption. If we do that, potential crises get cut off, and they don't escalate into full-blown crises, or problems are limited. If you think about a case of an epidemic, say in an urban area, if you can identify the people who have been infected with a disease at an early stage, and you isolate them, in this case isolation could be a good thing, then you don't have a widespread infection in the populace, and you keep a lid on a problem. If you're unable to identify the threat, take the appropriate measures, the contagion spreads, and all of a sudden you have a very, very large and dangerous problem on your hands. So in a crisis situation, there's often a need to take measures. And often those measures may be controversial. If we look at the volcanic ash crisis, which disrupted this conference, in many ways that was a crisis of precaution. And because there was a risk that was difficult to measure in some degrees with regard to the ash, it was decided that even at fairly low levels of concentration, that they would stop the flights. And there's going to be a big discussion about whether that was a good thing or not, and who's responsible for the costs. But it was felt that it was necessary to do that in order to prevent accidents. Then after a while, people would start doing new calculations, and they think, well, okay, maybe we can fly at higher levels of concentration, so more flights can go, and we can minimize the disruption, and we're prepared to make a different risk calculation. So that's often the case. In crisis, you have to act quick and dirty or not act at all. And that's something that people find very stressful. The more time that you have, the more experts you can consult, the more studies you can do, the more calculations, the firmer your knowledge base. But unfortunately, in crisis situations, you often have to make very difficult decisions under conditions of uncertainty regarding the nature of the threat. And that uncertainty can have to do with technical processes of various kinds, can have to do about whether intervention measures are going to work. If you think of Deepwater Horizon, the oil rig that oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico that's leaking. They're trying all kinds of technical quick fixes, and quite obviously they have no idea whether they're going to work or not. Many of them are fairly radical, innovative new measures. And there's uncertainty about where the oil is. You see the calculations being revised all the time, which is quite typical in these situations. Let me note that I'm going to use the concept of crisis as a point of departure for thinking about urban issues today, but there are a number of very closely related concepts that one should mention. There's the concept of disaster, which is very well grounded in the sociological discourse, which can be defined in a number of ways also, but it's often seen as a disruption of the order of a social system on a massive scale. There's the concept of security, which is key to this conference, and which I'm going to come back to in a second, just to say a few words about security. Security is what in the political science literature we call an essentially contested concept. There's a lot of ideology embedded in various notions of security. And in fact, it's not easy to make an apolitical choice when you define the term. And sometimes people define security in positive terms. Security shouldn't be about freedom from threats, but also about possibilities to achieve certain human values. And depending on where you put the emphasis, you may reach very different conclusions about the degree of security in a particular setting or the types of policies and security arrangements that are appropriate. Actually, I won't get back to it because that's what I wanted to say. And then the concepts of vulnerability and resilience. I'm not going to say much about vulnerability. I will say a few words about resilience. In the world of crisis management today, and also, of course, in a number of other discourses, for instance, about environmental sustainability, the notion of resilience is very important. And in this context, resilience is often about the capacity of a social system or an ecological system to bounce back from a threat. And so if we accept, as Folk Snickers was mentioning before, that we live in an unsafe world, then it's very important that we design systems that maybe we can't prevent all the bad things that could possibly happen from happening, but we need to be able to absorb the hits, minimize the damage, and get back to business as usual as fast as possible. And that's what resilience is about. In the States, they use the term homeland security to talk about many of these issues that we're talking about today. But in Britain, they talk about resilience. There's a UK resilience organization, and there are local and regional resilience teams. There's a London resilience forum, for instance, that works to try to make society safer. British model is very interesting. I may get back to that. I'm not going to talk about all of the trends that I think are germane to understanding crisis governance at the urban context, but I will say mention a number of them. We live in a world that's increasingly transnational. Many of the threats that we're concerned about and the possibilities of coping with them actually transcend not only local boundaries but national boundaries. And in fact, the security situation locally is affected by trends and developments on a much broader basis. If you look at SARS, for instance, it was a disease that emerged in an obscure corner of China and then quickly moved to cities in that part of the world like Hong Kong and Beijing, where life was basically brought to a standstill. And then suddenly with jet aircraft, it's in Ottawa and in Canada and causing all kinds of difficulties in urban settings. Crises are managed at many levels at the same time, and the possibilities of dealing with an issue are very much affected in multiple levels of jurisdiction. So you have a local environment, and as I've mentioned already, the coordination issues involved in dealing with a crisis at local level are non-trivial. It's an extremely big challenge just to get city government and other actors in urban environments working together in a good way. But then if you think that there are all of these other levels from county to national, now for Sweden and many other countries involved in regional organizations like the EU, you have a UN system, and somehow getting actors on all of these levels on the same page is a major issue. Crises are very complex. They're complex in their causation and in their implications. I'll take the SARS and Beijing example again. You're dealing with a health threat, but it's a health threat that scares people to such an extent that they don't dare to gather. People don't dare to come to your country to do business, so it becomes an economic problem. If you don't give your public and other governments, say, reliable information about what's happening so that they start to distrust you, it becomes a political problem as well. And so you see this sort of mutation effect that's quite common. Mediatization, one of the challenges of dealing with crisis in a city level, but also at many other levels, is the fact that we're dealing with a changed media structure and culture in many societies. If you take Sweden for an example, you have a media that's much more aggressive, much more competitive, much more diversified than we used to when it was primarily a public service and a few limited number of print media. And you have increasing competition between national media and international media. You have media working on a 24-hour news cycle, looking for a story, everybody trying to beat everybody else. Media researchers tell us that the difference between tabloids and regular newspapers are disappearing. So if you look at the highbrow media in Sweden today, you get to read all about Tiger Woods' love affair and all of that kind of stuff that wouldn't have been seen as appropriate to have in the serious media some years ago. We have, at the same time as the media game has become much tougher and more aggressive, you have a political game that also has. Used to be that if you were dealing with crises, that there was a norm that you rally around the flag and the opposition should be nice to the government until the crisis is over. This is not 100%, but there was a sense of certain degree of fair play in these situations, and that it was in the national interest to band together against an external adversary or against Mother Nature if you had a natural disaster. But consider the Swedish experience with the tsunami. Where at the same time as people were recovering from a horrendous natural disaster, the government came under tremendous fire from media and from the opposition for their inability to deal with the situation in a convincing fashion. PPNPP is actually a further development of a term that many of you probably recognize, public-private partnership, which one talks about when looking at urban development issues as well. I would argue that that's too narrow. We need to think in terms of public-private nonprofit partnership. If you look at the way that many crises have been managed, government either never had or in many cases no longer has the direct capacity that it needs to do things, which means that it becomes reliant on other types of actors. Privatization of critical infrastructure or corporatization of critical infrastructure, sometimes they're publicly held corporations, means that government can no longer just do things and take care of these systems. You get very complicated regulatory relationships that may have implications for both the degree of reliability of these systems and the ability to get them up and running and deal with the consequences of them. If you look at cases, let's take another context, not Sweden. Colleagues of mine in Poland looked at the flooding in the Oder River some years ago, tremendous floods. And it turned out that one of the best organized and most successful actors in terms of helping people and providing humanitarian relief in this emergency was the Boy Scouts. And so there is increasingly, and in Sweden too, because of the rationalization of the public sector, we now have what some regard as an anorexic state for a variety of political and economic reasons. We want government to run very lean and to be efficient, and there's still many inefficiencies in government, but it also means that we often don't have the reserve capacity to deal with emergency situations. And it's a little bit like if you're anorexic, you're also very vulnerable to other types of accidents or infections because there just isn't a whole lot of resources to spare in the body. In this room, or in this building, and I'm not a military guy, by the way, despite the fact that I work at the Defense College, there's a lot of concern about the fact that the defense is much smaller than it used to be in Sweden, and there aren't regiments all over the country like there used to be. Used to be that having regiments next door was a kind of a reserve capacity that you could use if the rescue services couldn't manage a crisis. But if they're not there anymore, who do you call when the local rescue services can't manage? There's a kind of an insurance policy that used to be there that's gone and has to be replaced. And I'm not saying that the more military is the answer, it's probably not. But we need to think of new ways of drawing upon societal resources and capabilities to make sure that we have the reserve capacity to deal with these issues. Technical change is very important, and there's both an upside and a downside to technical change. The upside is we can do things that we didn't used to be able to do. Our communication systems are much more effective. If we have a crisis in Thailand or in Lebanon, take a better example, we can actually now send SMSs to all the Swedish citizens whose telephones have been detected in Lebanon and tell them to check in so their relatives can find out that they're okay. Which was something that was done in an ad hoc way for the first time in Sweden during the tsunami. And that's something that we can now count on. On the other hand, we often know that crises occur when as in the Auckland case I mentioned, when our critical systems and our technology fails us. And so we need to be able to cope with that. And in fact, when it comes to the communication systems that I mentioned, they often fail under the usage surges that occur in the wake of a 9/11 or a 7/7. Everybody needs to get in touch and find out if their loved ones are okay. And of course, then the channels get logged and the internet goes down and people have less capacity to communicate than normal. There is a downside to urbanity from a security and crisis management perspective. Urban environments are crisis prone and vulnerable in a number of respects. You have high population density. You often have either latent or manifest social tensions. Vanya was talking about some of the challenges in dealing with that and preventing and minimizing them. You have a high degree of political visibility and symbolic loading. Terrorist attacks often, not always, but often occur in urban environments. Why is that? Because it's very dramatic when the World Trade Center collapses. Terrorists often engage in what is in the literature called performance violence. A very interesting term, performance violence. Incidents are staged for maximum visceral impact and for the images that the media will not be able to resist, that will create fear and hopefully social and psychological dynamics, political dynamics that the terrorists think will helpful to their cause. We have a high degree of interactive complexity. There's very interesting literature on normal accidents that Charles Perrow pioneered some years ago, very active discourse still, which talks about the way that accidents occur. And when you have systems with a high degree of complexity and tight coupling, when they get disrupted, sometimes small disruptions can have very big effects, and it's often difficult to anticipate the types of accidents that can occur, and the consequences may be very dramatic. Contagion we've talked about, and there are both social forms of contagion and of course literally illnesses. There are issues regarding evacuation. New Orleans was a very, very good example of that, and ironically it was both a very good and a very bad example. For those who had access to vehicles, the evacuation of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina was actually extremely effective, something that's not often noted. But on the other hand, the evacuation of people who were less privileged, who did not have access to their own vehicles, functioned very, very badly. And that was indicative of some of the issues that are involved. I can tell you, knowing something about this and working with some of the local officials involved, that anybody who has seen what rush hour looks like in Stockholm these days on an ordinary day can imagine what it would look like if one had to evacuate a substantial portion of Stockholm in an emergency. Can't even... it's hard to imagine the chaos that would be likely to emerge. I think a lot of work has to be done to improve that situation. There is an upside, and I think many of this would be true of cities in the global south as well, but just to be safe, I'll say I'm mostly talking about first world urbanity. You're dealing with environments that are resilient in many respects. They're often rich in resources and in expertise, and in these situations, knowledge is power. You have to get a handle on what's happening, so access to experts can be extremely important. In fact, I'm going to be giving a talk at the Swedish Defense Ministry tomorrow on that topic. It's important to have a potential for effective concentrated intervention, which often exists in cities like this. You have capable or improvable, if they're not, blue light organizations, police, rescue services, etc. You often have an emergent response potential. What do I mean by that? When you're dealing with major disasters and accidents, it's not always the authorities who are who are actually on site first. If you look at the 7/7 bombings in London, one of the things that was very important there was that by fortuitous coincidence, there was a surgical convention right across the street from one of the main accident sites. And so you had hundreds of doctors and other medical personnel who were there and ran across the street and started treating victims. And that was extremely helpful, and it was lucky. And it's the kind of thing that tends not to happen out in the countryside. Cities are a focal point for mass media. That causes challenges, but also creates a possibility for political visibility, drawing rights on societal resources. Core areas often have attention advantages, and you can say that the peripheral areas have attention deficits. Serious problems can occur for a long time, and maybe nobody acts on them. Almost done here. The complexity of the problems that emerge in these situations is such that there's often a need for many different actors inside of government and outside of government to work together. And that, if one assumes goodwill on the parts of the responders in these situations, and that's the case more often than not, you would think that it wouldn't be so difficult to get them working together, but in fact it is. You're dealing with large numbers of people, complex organizations. They have different cultures, they have different procedures, they use different language, and it takes a lot of work to get them to understand each other effectively and be able to cooperate. In a way, there's a parallel with interdisciplinary scientific conversations too, because we all have our jargons, and we have to be careful to try not to use terms without defining them and making them clear, and that takes time and work, and time is obviously one of the things that you don't have in a crisis situation. What we are seeing in many urban environments is an increasing institutionalization and professionalization of crisis management capacity, and that's both within sectors like the police or medical services, but also, and this is very important, there's increasing attention on the problem of getting these people to work effectively together. And there are new forms of education and training and new ways of working and exploiting new technologies in order to help them to understand situations in a more effective way and to work together. And the solutions that have been chosen look different in different countries. I think the UK is a very interesting model. So is Holland, which has a system called GRIP, G-R-I-P. Sweden has a lot of work still to do in this area. If you look at both the way that city governments work together and the way that city governments collaborate with other actors like the county medical boards, the county general county boards, länsstyrelsen as they say in Swedish, the police, and others. There are jurisdictional and legal problems that make it very hard for them to work together, and there really is not yet a common paradigm that's been explicated and authorized and deployed across the country. Pretty much every county works together, or sometimes doesn't, unfortunately, in a different way. And there is no real sustained commitment to identifying best practices and moving forward in this area. Interestingly, though, there was recently a government bill in this area that identified the problem and suggested this is something that we have to do. Okay, well, my time for my talk is up, but I will be very pleased to take questions.